Good morning. I'd like to welcome you all to the opening session of the second Industrial Ecology Day. This day is organized by the International Society of Industrial Ecology, and it features events across the globe, starting here in Australia and ending in California in the US. Let me start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands I meet you from, the Ngunnawal people, who are making a continued contribution to the culture, environment, and economy of the Canberra region. My name is Heinz Schandl. I'm a senior science leader at the National Science Agency, the CSIRO, and I'm also the past immediate president of the International Society of Industrial Ecology. I'm very proud to open this second global event. We're focusing today on the opportunities that are presented by a low-carbon circular economy. The science of industrial ecology has contributed many solutions to achieving sustainable materials management, reducing waste and emissions, and reducing the impact we have on our primary resources. Today, we are focusing on the transition to a low-carbon and circular economy in Australia. And we need to do this against the backdrop of the structure of the Australian economy. Australia is the largest provider of materials globally. We consume embodied materials, waste, and carbon emissions through the purchases we make as a very wealthy urban population. As a result, Australia has the largest material and carbon footprint, one of the largest anyway, globally. And yet it has been shown that a transition to a low-carbon circular economy actually offers very large economic, social, and environmental opportunities for Australia. Let me introduce our panel to you. We're joined by Pep Canadell. He's a chief research scientist with the CSIRO and executive director of the Global Carbon Project. We have Jordy. She's a circular economy expert with Oricon, also affiliated with Adelaide University. Simon Corbell, the board chair of the Clean Energy Investor Group. Ian Overton, CEO of Green Industries South Australia, and Gail Sloan, the CEO of the Waste Management and Resource Recovery Association. We're going to have a discussion about the question, how can we reduce carbon emissions, resource use, and waste in an extractive and consumer economy? We will start with short inputs of all the panelists, followed by a Q&A. You have the opportunity to use the Q&A functions on your meeting panel to ask questions or to make comments. We will answer as many questions as we can in the meet, and all the questions that you ask will be answered afterwards if we can't get to those questions. But I'd like first to go to Pep to kick us off, to talk about carbon budgets and greenhouse gas emissions from a global and Australian perspective. Thank you, Pep.
Thank you, Heinz. I assume you can see my screen.
We can.
Let me just move very quickly. So I'm showing here, data that we just released 2 weeks ago, which is the new global. What we see is that for 2022, we expect fossil carbon emissions, anything that has to do with the use, consumption, combustion, and also cement production emissions, are going to go up to about 36.6 billion tons of carbon. That is now higher than pre-pandemic, when we had a massive drop of emissions. And land use change, which is the combination of everything that we do to the land, from land clearing to regrowth, reforestation, is about almost 4 billion tons of carbon. Together, put us at a mark, which we've been there for almost a decade, of close to 40 billion tons of CO2, and growing from a fossil fuel perspective. That has led to the situation almost now really critical, that the remaining carbon budgets to some of the critical Paris Agreement objectives are now almost at the edge of not being attainable anymore. The 1.5, if we were to maintain CO2 emissions at the level of 2022, we would, completely consume 380 billion tons, which are still remain before we reach 1.5 in about 9 years, and of course more years if, we go at a higher temperature levels. Now, we don't expect, of course, to stay at the same level of emissions. We expect that emissions to peak really soon. Actually, they have to peak almost immediately, although we think that the peak on global emissions is not yet any soon, that we need still a few more years. But if we were just to kind of on a linear trajectory going down immediately, we would still kind of reach 1.5 at 2040, or the various budgets that I'm showing here from 2040 to 2080. The only good news, if we call it good news, is that the average annual growth has actually declined quite significantly over the last decade at about 0.5%. And if we compare it to what has happened over the last about 60 years, which we have grown to more than 2%. The reason I'm showing you all these numbers is not just to say we're kind of completely, doomed, but it's almost the opposite, to show that incredible pressure that we have now, and that there'll be nonstop from this point on countries to do a faster and bigger, decarbonization. So Australia's greenhouse emissions commitments is about by 2030, an emission reduction of minus 43%. The pressure is on. There's a league of countries, all with commitments above 50%, New Zealand, US, EU, UK, things that are putting pressure for us to do more and faster, and of course the net zero emissions by 2050. Where we are in this country, well, this is the energy consumption for the last 20 years, and we have more than 85% full consumption coming straight to fossil fuels, and this is a wholesale, completely transition to low zero carbon emissions. So a humongous challenge ahead for us. Coal really on the way down, no doubt about it, but both oil and gas going up. And if we see a little, declines here, these are still remaining components of the big COVID lockdowns crisis. If we map those energy consumption into emissions from the various sectors, so yes, we have a higher, the top emission component coming from the electricity production. Of course, that's the coal component there. All the stationary energy, heating, transport, agriculture, fugitive emissions, everything that has to do with mining and the handling of natural gas, industrial processes, waste. And here we see the land use change and forestry component at the very end here on our right, where it is actually a sink of CO2. So it means that we are regrowing more vegetation that we are clearing. And just to finish, what has happened so far? And that's quite important, because it really sets the stage for what needs to happen, and of course the opportunities that where they exist. So our reference year is 2005. We are at 2022, and so far what has happened is that we've done quite good with electricity. There's been a decline of about 35% in emissions since 2005. That's all the renewable energy we put into the system, but the stationary energy, transport, fugitive emissions, industrial process, they all have gone up. We have a decline in agriculture, partially because we went through major drought events, which has had huge negative impacts. Ways we've done well. And then the biggest component of our good balance comes from land use change. So from an energy point of view, basically the whole work still needs to be done, and therefore the opportunities are unlimited. Because again, we have now realized or over-relied too much on that land use change component, which cannot continue to go forever, to help us to do this net decline as committed to 2030 and of course 2050 net zero emissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pep. Moving to you, Jordy, it's often been said that the circular economy, next to offering economic opportunities, is also going to make a contribution to carbon reduction. So let's hear from you, Jordy, about the circular economy in Australia from a science point of view.
Thank you, Heinz. That's fantastic. And thanks everyone for joining us. It's great to be able to kick off this International Day in Australia. So we're really finding in industry and in scientific circles that linkage between net zero and circular economy is becoming a lot more clear than it used to be. So basically around 55% of the carbon budgets globally are linked to energy systems. So the energy sector itself, the energy to transport things, and the energy to heat and cool buildings. But 45% of global carbon budgets are to do with the products, the materials, and the land use associated with that. So while we absolutely need to radically change energy systems, we also need to look at the materials and products that are around us. And so it's really essential to be thinking about circular economy when we're thinking about net zero. I'm just going to share my screen now. I hope that's working. So this is very basic, and I'm sure everyone knows this by their heart, but it's really important each time we're talking about this to reframe what we mean by circular economy and the fact that it's really a systems approach to work by design to actually remove waste and pollution out of our economic systems. Then once we have materials and things in the system, we keep them circulating at their highest value as far as possible. And then thirdly, regenerate natural systems. The reason why I bring this out again every time is because there's a lot of critique of circular economy that it won't actually achieve a sustainable system because we can't rely on things just circulating again and again. We can't recycle our way out of this mess because every loop, of course, we're losing energy, we're losing materials. And that's where the regenerate natural systems is so important because we actually need to be working with our planet to be able to keep growing things and keep absorbing all those natural ecosystem services that we're talking about. So scientifically, there's a lot of evidence-based out there. I got really excited when Heinz asked me to talk about the science, and while I'm not presenting the numbers, I love thinking about all the different scientific disciplines that are involved in looking at the evidence base for doing different circular economy approaches. So if we think of circular economy really as a framework and approach to get to net zero, to get to sustainable systems, we need all these different scientific disciplines to understand which directions we should be going in. So that's things like mass flow analysis, life cycle assessment, all the economic modelling, all the climate science that's needed to actually produce that evidence base. And then to actually develop circular solutions, of course, we need material science, but we also need all the soft sciences, behavioural science, economics, etc. So it's really such a plethora of different scientific knowledge and capability that's required both to understand where we're going and to achieve the changes that we're talking about, which is why it's exciting to be with the CSIRO today. And thinking about circular economy as this kind of umbrella framework that brings together all these different disciplines that you'll all be in today. And I know a lot of industrial ecology people would like to put industrial ecology in the umbrella. It doesn't really matter which way we go, but understanding that there's different frameworks to weave together all the different science to do it. I also just wanted to flag, though, that there is a lot of critique, and I think there's circular economy has become so ubiquitous now that we're seeing a lot of kind of greenwashing, circular washing. So I almost cried last week at a conference when people were getting really excited about coffee capsule recycling. That doesn't really address systemic change to our economies. And this is a bike that's made out of recycled coffee capsules. I really challenge everyone participating today and working in the industrial ecology space to really think about shifting entire systems and not being quite myopic and looking at specific recycling-based small solutions and coffee cups and things like that, and really thinking about shifting the entire system towards a circular economy to get to those incredibly important net zero targets that we were talking about just before. Thank you. I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Jordy. I think that's a good segue to you, Simon. So changing entire systems, you have some experience in how this can be done with electricity generation in Canberra. But we also know policy plays an important role. We are not going to achieve net zero and circular through just individual actions What's your thinking, Simon, in regard to where we are in Australia in that regard?
Thanks very much, Heinz. Great to be with everyone this morning, and I'm really keen to unpack this question that you raised, Heinz, around the policy and regulatory environment, because 2022 has been such a critical year for the Australian policy and regulatory environment. Obviously, this year was marked by a federal election in May, and earlier this year, and the result of that federal election, of course, was a change in the national government and a very strong groundswell across the Australian community for action on climate change and action to address Australia's emissions profile, and also to rectify the recalcitrant nature of the Australian government over the past decade. And we saw this reflected not only in the election of the new federal Labor government, which went to the election with a policy, as Pep's outlined, of 43% reduction by 2030 in Australia's greenhouse gas emissions, but also a very strong groundswell across the Australian community more broadly, particularly in metropolitan seats, traditionally conservative voting, who shifted to independence to achieve effectively a supermajority for climate action in the Australian Parliament. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, obviously the passage of the new climate change legislation, a legislative target, was adopted by the Parliament in the last month, and that establishes that 43% emissions reduction objective by 2030. But importantly, it also reinstates and strengthens architecture around accountability in the policy environment. So a new reinvigorated climate change authority to give independent advice to the government of the day, which is public, on the science and the measures needed to address the government's targets, and indeed to go further, consistent with the science of achieving a 1.5 degree outcome. And also requirements on accountability on the federal minister to report annually on action and to provide a clear framework for what the government is doing to respond to those measures and those targets. And that first climate statement will actually be tabled by our new federal minister, Chris Bowen, this week in the last sitting of the Parliament for the year. So some really important policy and regulatory change occurring at a national level. I think what's also very exciting is in the energy sector, the new government has a commitment for the effective achievement of 83% clean energy in the Australian electricity supply sector by the early 2030s. This is an enormous shift. To give a sense of the scale of change required, it's around $320 billion worth of investment required over the next decade to build out over 10,000 kilometres of new transmission lines, an enormous increase in the amount of renewable energy generation, and also a very substantive commitment to clean energy storage. Shifting the carbon intensity of the electricity supply sector requires a very high level of firm electricity generation. And whilst Australia has remarkable wind and solar resources, which will be fully capitalised by investors in this space under this new policy environment, there is still a need for firm dispatchable supply. And so we're now seeing strong commitments both by the previous federal government with the development of the Snowy 2.0 pumped hydro project, which will deliver around 5 gigawatts of dispatchable energy storage, but now being matched by an equivalent commitment by the Queensland state government, where a very clear timetable to phase out the state-owned coal generators in Queensland and replace it with around 7 gigawatts of pumped hydro storage, as well as complementary wind and solar generation, to really shift what is the newest part of the coal generation fleet in the Australian grid out of the system by the mid-2030s. So this is a really significant shift in what is one of the most resource-intensive states in the country, and a very clear framework occurring there. The final comment I'd make is that outside of the electricity supply sector, we're also seeing very strong commitments in transport, the transport sector. The transport sector, obviously, as Pep's outlined, another very significant emissions reduction area for the Australian economy as a whole. And we're seeing strong commitments by the national government to firstly develop a much overdue piece of regulatory architecture in terms of a fuel emission standards for the Australian transport fleet, something badly missing, as well as a very strong commitment to incentivise the uptake of electric vehicles, including removing taxation imposts that currently exist for electric vehicles, particularly in the fleet procurement, as well as for private purchases. So whilst there's a lot more going on, Heinz, I'd simply say that since the federal election, the direction of travel is overwhelmingly positive. Investors are responding to this very strongly. We're seeing huge pools of capital in the billions of dollars being put forward for investment in the Australian economy. And whilst there is still much work to be done and much more ambition to be improved in terms of our emissions reductions objectives, there is a marked and substantial shift compared to 12 months ago.
Thank you, Simon. This is encouraging, and we go to Ian because I think you are telling a kind of a similar story for what's happening in South Australia, but also across Australia in regard to how we are moving to greater circularity. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Heinz. Yeah, look, I'm going to jump a little bit down to scale to a state. So I'd like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I come from, which are the Kaurna people in South Australia. I'm going to touch on all three topics, three speakers before actually. So I'm going to start off with what Simon was saying about the commitment of Australia to net zero. South Australia has made a declaration of a climate emergency. We did that this year and committed to a net zero by 2050, but we recognise that we will not get to net zero without a circular economy. In Pep's graph, he showed the first three emitters were electricity, static energy and transport. Those all get tackled by what Jordy was saying was the 55% of the emissions coming from the energy system. The 45% of products, the number one on Pep's graph after that was agriculture. If you look at my graph on the right-hand side there, this is an example from Ellen MacArthur Foundation. This is the emissions that are coming from the global food system. We can tackle 49% of those emissions by doing some circular principles, eliminating food waste, turning that food waste into compost, and then putting that back in as regenerative agriculture. So that's a significant component of that.
Just to mention, Ian, we don't see any figures. If you have figures up, then they're not yet.
Do you see my slide?
Not yet.
Ah.
So maybe let's change that.
Do you see my slides now?
Not yet. Yeah, they're coming. We need to go to the presentation.
Thank you, Heinz. I'm just going to fix that.
Okay.
Apologies, everybody, for that.
No big deal. Here we go.
Right. There are two buttons to share for Gail. You press the screen that you want to share, then you press share. So apologies for that. So the graph on the right-hand side, which you can now see, is the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, food production, whereby if we adopt circular principles of eliminate food waste, composting and regenerative agriculture, we tackle 49% of those emissions. So it's clear that we need a circular economy to tackle a major part of net zero, but it's also a critical component to achieving a lot of the sustainable development goals. So other things like biodiversity all get wrapped up in the circular economy. From a national perspective, we have the National Waste Policy and the National Waste Policy Action Plan that came out in 2019, where we're tackling as a nation a lot of our waste through waste export bans as a result of China's sword. We've invested significant amounts in infrastructure and product stewardship schemes and a number of other activities at a national scale, also reducing our food waste with a goal of reducing food waste by half by 2030. And very recently, our Federal Minister has come out announcing that Australia will be circular by 2030. I've put that in quotes because we're still yet to do the definition of what circular means and how we're going to get there, but we're going to get there by 2030. From a state perspective, we've had a waste strategy, which we call a vision for a circular economy, and that sets a target of zero avoidable landfill by 2030. And our food waste target is to have zero food waste. And by that, we mean any food that is not consumed gets put back into the circular system for growing crops. Part of our food waste strategy as well is to address commercial food sectors and household food sectors to ensure that we get the maximum amount of food going back. Other areas such as circular glass and single-use plastics are initiatives that we're trying to push to the state level. And I just want to run through 3 slides of what a zero glass state might look like. So in South Australia, we've had what we call a container deposit scheme, which is 10 cents on a bottle. We've had that since 1977. The black and white photograph shows a picture of a football match at the end, I think 45 years ago, and the litter that was left. So it was introduced as a litter reduction program, but now it's seen very much as a resource recovery program. This container deposit of 10 cents allows organisations such as the Scouts to earn money, and the bins that you see on the bottom right hand of the screen there are new bins that we've put into the main shopping centre of the capital city of South Australia. And on the side, on the yellow side, you'll see that there's an open area for people to put their containers, their glass bottles, so that homeless people can pick those up and get the 10 cents. So it's quite an integral part of our economic system, but it is mainly a role of getting the glass from containers back into a circular process. So the next slide is about the processing. So SA has more glass furnaces than every other state put together in Australia, because we are the wine state. We produce more wine than anyone else. And I'm going to give you an example of one company called Aurora, who's just released their glass beneficiation plant. That uses 80% of South Australia's CDS glass. It can take any colour, any type of glass, and it produces 150,000 tonnes of glass colour a year, which is equivalent to 750 million beer bottles. It allows Aurora to make glass wine bottles that that move from 30% recycled content to 70% recycled content in the wine bottles. And this is in particular important because wine export is one of South Australia's biggest industries. And Europe and other places have flagged that unless you have a significant amount of recycled content in your packaging, you will not be able to sell your product. Not only does this allow us to get that glass in circularity, it also obviously diverts from landfill and diverts glass from being used in roads in a downcycling way, and it gets glass back bottle to bottle. So in Aurora, they also manufacture that glass. They manufacture 1 million bottles per annum, and this bottle to bottle is what we're trying to achieve. The other aspects of this recycled content is that if we use this 150,000 tonnes, we increase our recycled content by 34%. We decrease our energy by 8%. We decrease our CO2 emissions by 18%. It creates 390 jobs, and it avoids 180,000 tonnes of raw material being mined, as well as 150,000 tonnes out of landfill. Other areas they're moving to is oxygen-fueled furnaces, and they've stated that they will be net zero by 2050. So I wanted to mention about the initiatives that the Australian and the state government are doing from a government perspective. But government is not simply leading this. I think it's a partnership between industry, and these are the kind of things that we see coming out of industry. They state very clearly that there's a circular economy objective, infinitely recyclable products, as well as their climate change and community initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Let's go to Gail. Let's go to you next. I think, Gail, the industries you're representing may perhaps say the best way to manage waste is not to create the waste in the first place. Over to you, Gail. You might be muted. You can see your slide scale, but you may be muted.
There you go. All right. Too many buttons on the system I don't use. So I'm going to go back to hopefully the start. I should not have tried to do this. All right. I am the wastie. I can't seem to now move my slides, so I don't know what I've done. I'm going to get rid of that. I'm just going to go back to me because I think that's easier. Stop sharing. All right. I am the wastie in this, and I guess for me, it's a bit unusual coming at the end of this. Coming from the previous speakers, though, I guess what we've seen is Australia is fantastic at recycling. You know, we talk only really until recently about recycling and a recycling economy, and my sector is absolutely key in the success to that. I strongly believe that we do the heavy lifting and we actually address what is a fundamentally poor design, and we constantly find solutions to that. So from Australian point of view, in the slides that I had, we're talking about the fact that we generate 76 to 78 million tonnes of waste annually. We haven't until this year actually talked about that as a resource or necessarily witnessed that as a resource. As Simon mentioned earlier, we actually haven't had carbon targets until this year either. So we now actually have a number of targets that we're chasing in Australia: 80% diversion by 2030, 43% reduction in emissions by 2030 as well. It may come as a surprise to you that we actually have no target that joins material resourcefulness with emissions as yet either, so that we've got a very, very long way to go when it comes to think about what we consume and how we change the patterns of what we do to achieve both of those targets. We've sat traditionally at a 60% recovery rate with the 27 million tonnes going to landfill for many years in Australia. So it says to me and everyone else who's listening that business as usual for a recycling economy is not going to get us there. We have to actually grow 14 million tonnes worth of demand in the next 90 months. And we have to bring on shore 2 million tonnes per annum of infrastructure, and therefore 2 million tonnes of demand for recovered materials and recycled materials every year for the next 7 years. So it's a pretty mammoth target for us to hit either of our goals of 80% recovery and the 43% reduction. So we know, like you probably all know on this call, it starts at design, how we design out waste and pollution, how we select materials that we can actually use, reuse, repair, in order that we can recover it ultimately at end of life. And we actually have a really long way to go in Australia on that, I hate to say. You know, we've done a great job today of thinking about how we can turn products into other products. Back to Jody's Nespresso pods, that just makes me sick. We're currently trying to put those through yellow bins at the moment and pretend they're recyclable. So no wonder there's a huge amount of confusion in the public out there about what can go into what bin. Again, very linear thinking, as opposed to what do we consume in a mindful way that can be generally reused or recovered, and not even put into the linear system of a bin and then a heavy industrial system to actually turn it into another product. Haven't quite, and I guess I'm the negative Nelly at the end of the call, but maybe it'll start lots of conversations. We actually haven't grappled with the idea well that secondary raw materials makes a massive difference upon reducing reliance on virgin and reducing reliance on energy. We're absolutely in the midst of an energy crisis in Australia, whether it's availability or cost, and we actually haven't worked out how we could both use waste as an energy source, be it through anaerobic digestion or a thermal process, but also how we can diminish the demand on energy by using secondary raw materials rather than virgin. We know overseas there's a lot of thinking being done, a lot of proof being done about the massive savings in energy from using recyclate once it gets to end of life. So whilst it might not seem that I'm excited, I'm very, very excited, because for the first time ever, we've got a government that's using the word circular We've actually got potentially a real move to product stewardship schemes with genuine EPR and placing emphasis on design and generators of what they bring to market. We're about to see a number of schemes commenced on solar panels that have got more government intervention than before, and e-waste. We are starting to think end of life. We are really starting to think polluter pays, and we are very much thinking about carbon and emissions and how we achieve there. So for me, Heinz posed the question at the start, how do we achieve reduction in emissions, resource use and waste in an extractive and consumer driven economy? For me, there's three things. There's design, education and regulation. Because what we've seen to date in Australia, the business usual approach of let the market solve it is not going to work. So I have the answer. Over to you, Heinz.
No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you, Gail. Thank you to all the speakers. So people who are watching the webcast, we invite you to have your questions in the Q&A now. And we do have a question for Simon in regards to the waste management strategies and plans to handle the uptake of electric vehicles. The question says, considering the lack of a strong national waste management policy in Australia regarding the end of life of vehicles, how are we going to do that?
Well, it's a good question, Heinz, and I think the answer to that from a political decision maker's perspective is that the first objective is to get more electric vehicles on Australian roads. That's the first objective, because at the moment in the Australian economy, I heard the figure, I think yesterday, we only sell, only about 2 to 3% of all new vehicle sales in Australia at the moment are electric vehicles. Now compare that with other developed economies, particularly in Europe, but also in North America, and it is miserably low. So we need, first and foremost, to get more electric vehicles on the road. The second, of course, is that the lifespan of a vehicle in the Australian market is around 15 to 20 years before it's replaced. So we've got a decade-long at least environment to manage the end of life of vehicles, and it is absolutely essential that we have a policy and regulatory environment to address that. But I would say, compared to some of our other challenges, we have the time to develop those frameworks. We should be doing that now, and the new government, as Gail mentioned, is very focused on new technology, recycling focuses, and we've seen that most recently with the Environment Minister indicating she is going to step in and mandate regulatory responses to deal with solar panels, for example, of which there is an enormous and emerging waste stream challenge. So I think we will see similar thinking, particularly around components of electric vehicles, but we have the time. And the first requirement is to get more EVs on the road to reduce the emissions profile of our transport sector in particular.
Thanks, Simon. There's a question for you, Pat, which is about whether the carbon emissions of the bushfires were actually included in your assessment for Australia.
Yeah, so I think that it's really important to know that emissions are actually part of the overall budgeting, but emissions from fires in Australia, they're largely, but not totally, recovered by the subsequent regrowth. And we've seen this thing particularly for the Black Summer bushfires, where so much regrowth has actually taken place. That's not full replacement of 100% of emissions back to the vegetation, but we've seen in places where, from a biomass point of view, from a carbon point of view, we have almost reached, almost like full recovery. Now, that has nothing to do with everything else that has happened to the ecosystems, to the biodiversity, to the functioning of the systems, to even the structure of the forest, which are completely different. But from a carbon point of view, yes, we do take into account emissions, but many of these emissions come back over the following years, and in an extraordinary way over the past 2.5 years, because we had these La Nina conditions where regrowth has been really, really strong.
That's right. So Ian, you have your hand up. We do that like in a real Me too.
It's
Please.
a real thing. I was just going to make a comment, Heinz, on the last question. We, 2% of sales being EVs, and, Simon saying we've got time, but that's just so slow. That's so gradual to get those sales coming through. If we think about it from a circular economy point of view, those vehicles that are out there on the roads now are fine, but they've just got an internal combustion engine. If we swap that engine out for an electric engine, the windscreen, the steering wheel, the seats, it's all fine. So how do we actually shift this using circular economy principles to get EVs out there? What we need is the batteries. So Australia needs to be manufacturing batteries, we need to be recycling lithium batteries, and we need to be retrofitting our vehicles.
We have another question from Robert, which is about the role of local councils in the circular economy transition. What should local councils focus on? So I throw that to Jordy and then to you, Gail. What should local councils focus on?
Hi, that's a great question. And local councils are really at that cutting edge of the circular economy. They're so close to communities. They're so close that waste management system is a really important part of what they do, but their connection to community is incredibly important. So there's a couple of things that are really essential for them to be doing. It's working on that sort of culture change piece with communities. It's supporting the infrastructure change that's required for waste and recycling that Gail will probably jump on next. She'll have great tips on that. But also rethinking the planning and the physical space in which people reside and how they interact with the economy. We're doing a lot of work around resilient asset management planning as well as part of that interface between climate change and circular economy as well. We need to have much more resilient spaces at a council level. That's going to be very important to reacting to these fires and floods and things that we're seeing already from a climate challenge that create a lot of waste, and maintaining assets and keeping them going as long as possible at that council level is really important and interesting. I want to throw to Gail. I don't know if that's what you were going to do, Heinz.
Absolutely.
I just get really excited about this because I used to work in councils and I had no idea what I was doing. And if I ever went back, I'd probably do a lot of this stuff. So I think about circular economy in councils about the 3 Ps, people, place and prosperity. And really the goal of a local council is to build a place and a sense of place and a sense of belonging, right? That's where you get all the good stuff, right, out of sustainability. So if I was tackling it now and I actually was a general manager of a council, I'd be talking about education, I'd be talking about consumption, I'd be having conversations about, do you need this? How do we avoid this? How do we build better for sharing, shared spaces, connectivity? I'd actually completely rethink about what we do. Are we sustainable where we need to be? Are we buying the food where we need to? Are we buying the food we need rather than the food we want? Can we actually talk to you about avoidance and keeping money in the hip pocket, reducing energy? So I'd be building a place that is quite different to one that is just rates, roads and rubbish. And waste probably wouldn't, if I was talking circular, I doubt I'd even talk about the waste contract for a long time. I'd be talking far more up the hierarchy around avoidance, energy, solar, regenerative, a very different mindset I'd take than a waste and resource recovery. So, as they say, youth is wasted on the young. I wish I could almost go back there now knowing what I do and build that circular place in local councils. And of course, whilst we're walking and chewing gum, there's a lot of great stuff going on at the moment around driving demand and creating jobs through using recyclate. And, whatever you take in the bin, you pull back. So you start to tell those stories in situ around the materials you generate. So you build that, go through that recycling economy to that circular economy, but it's so much more than what you put in a bin.
Excellent. So it's really exciting times for local councils. I wish I could join in. Let me throw another question to Ian before I go to the next Q&A question. Ian, you talked about circular by 2030 for South Australia as an ambition. We've done a study at CSIRO some years ago for the Department of Environment and Energy Efficiency, where we established that the current circularity in Australia is at 3.5%. When you look at the overall material that we manage in the economy. We then looked at the potential in the current structure, what could we achieve? And the circularity rate could go up to 20%. What does it mean to be fully circular by 2030?
Great question. When you said we're currently 3% and how are we going to get there from 2030, I was kind of thinking, you wouldn't start running a race if there was no finish line. So we set a finishing line. We set a big, hairy, audacious goal. We try and create a vision about what life would be like if we were circular, to solve all the challenges, and that inspires people to move forward. And then we can support that with, infrastructure, policies, etc. But what does it mean to actually be circular? I think you've got to look at this in its geographical context too, because we are not going to make a council circular by putting a big fence around the council and say nothing comes in, nothing goes out. That's not kind of what we mean by circularity. We have to work within our state boundaries, our national boundaries, but it's a global problem, and these are global, global markets that we're dealing with. So you have to take that in consideration. We can put product bans in, and then people can just buy off eBay and bring this kind of stuff in. So we have to think broader in terms of just our small areas and collaborate and think geographically. For me, circularity means that we adopt those principles of keeping materials in use longer, that we look to use recycled content rather than raw material, and we stop talking about waste. Waste doesn't exist. It's the stuff that we can't recycle, and we're going to try and reduce as much stuff that we can't recycle or reuse as possible and keep that in circularity. That's the goal, and we've set an ambition for 2030. Will we measure it on your basis? No, I don't think we're going to measure it, and I don't think we're going to say 3.2 and we've got from 3.2 to 20. I think that lacks a certain, it doesn't inspire people to really change, and we need to change on two ways. One is the consumer behaviour. Every individual choice that we make about the purchases that we do or where we do put something makes a difference. But it's the big systems, the material flows. If you look at the amount of material that built environment uses, those are the things that got to shift. And consumer behaviour doesn't shift built environment. That's big policy changes through government and industry.
I'll go to you next, Jordy, and then to Simon. So you have your hand up, Jordy. Is that real?
I just wanted to make a small point as well. So while these kind of 3.6%, and we see the circular economy, the circular gap indicator are used a lot, that are really useful figures to understand that looping of resources in the big system, but it's really not measuring how we're slowing things down and keeping things in the system longer as well. So at the moment, we don't have a single magic metric of circularity that really encompasses the value of slowing down our economic systems as well. So I think there needs to be space in some of the policy making and the communication to really think about how we slow our systems down and the value of where we're keeping things in our economy and not just cycling them back as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Simon, there's another question from Mel. She asked, how do we best incentivize a move from competition to cooperation to transition critical value chains?
Sorry, could you repeat the last part of your question?
So how can we move from competition to cooperation when we want to transition the critical value chains that allow for net zero and circular to occur?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I think from my perspective, we first and foremost need to think about whether we're achieving. It's a leadership question fundamentally. I think where we are achieving this, first of all, at a political decision-making level. So we need to make sure that there is collaboration across our political decision makers in setting the frameworks and big architecture that drives change in the economy. And I think what's been really interesting is that we've seen political parties who are not completely aligned on the objectives they want to achieve in terms of, for example, emissions reduction in the Australian economy, nevertheless coalescing around a point in time which says, well, we're going to legislate a target or 43% reduction in our economy, and we're going to do that even though we know we need to do more, because that's the point in time where this is the point we can all agree on as the base point. So it's basically a baseline, not an end target. It's a baseline target that we build upon and build ambition and build capacity to do more. So whether it was Labor, the Greens, other independents, we saw a coalescing around this target, even though even though we know the science tells us that we need to do more. And I think it's going to be the same in the broader economy and the broader community. We're going to see the opportunities for collaboration and enabling transition, particularly in the energy sector, to occur where competitors in the same space are starting to work with, for example, fossil fuel extractive industries who recognise they need to transition their workforces and they need to work with new technology providers and new investors. For example, a great example is in offshore wind, where we're going to see offshore wind play a really critical role in the future of the Australian energy generation sector because of its scale, because of its complementarity with onshore generation, but also its capacity to transition workforces from offshore oil and gas extractive processes, and those workforces shift across into the new energy generation sectors of offshore wind, and potentially also hydrogen manufacture as well. So we see the compelling architecture of managing the transition driving a level of cooperation, whilst there's still being competition in technologies, competition in the investment proposition, but also the need to bring different sectors together. So I think that's a great example of what can be realised, and really it's the moment that we face as a community, as a society, is that we must find those points of commonality and cooperation if we're going to achieve these very significant transitions that we are having to achieve for the sake of a safe climate future.
So there's a question which relates to that, Simon, which maybe Gail, you want to pick that up. So how can we mainstream the urgency of a circular economy and net zero transition into everything that we do? How would we do that?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I don't actually have an answer for that one, because I was just listening to Simon thinking about, I think because the ground shifted so much and the rules are actually starting to change for a lot of people and a lot of organisations, you know, you can no longer get away with what you used to. So we've seen a phenomenal impact on AGL and others who used to just go, I'm just going to keep going the way I'm going, right? And you can get away with it. And they increasingly find that you can no longer get away with it. So not necessarily AGL, but I just mean that sort of the rules have changed. And I think that urgency piece, and I was just reflecting, you know, I have friends who still don't really believe that climate change is an issue and it's just a Labor Party thing. So I think we've just got to keep having these critical conversations and pointing to the facts and the evidence. I think that's what's going to change it over time is, you know, we have to model and change the behaviours. We have to start having conversations that, one of the ones that drives me nuts is retail sales. Like, we encourage people to spend. We actually need to start talking, you know, my nirvana. I know when I've succeeded when Alan Kohler doesn't put up a sign on retail sales, but puts on the amount of recycled content that we're actually using in the marketplace. So we just have to start modelling and changing the behaviour, because, you know, if Australia doesn't get that these natural disasters, and I literally limp from COVID to fire to flood in jurisdiction, you know, I'm on a working group or a ministerial council in every jurisdiction on a disaster of some sort. If that's not enough to convince people that we're in a seriously challenging and difficult time that needs to change behaviour, no matter how much communication we put out there, it's not going to change. So we have to focus, I think, on changing behaviour and creating that space to keep having those conversations and helping people, assisting people to change what they're doing.
So we have Ian and then Jordy jumping in.
Because I didn't answer the question, I feel the need to answer it for me.
I'm not sure what's going to happen, but we'll see.
No, you did answer the question, Gail, and I did like your answer, but I just wanted to add something to it. We can do behaviour change to the cows come home. If the system isn't in place, it just doesn't kind of work. So I liked your answer, but I'd add that we need to change the economic drivers of the system. So there needs to be taxes on, you know, virgin material products that, you know, we need to drive, and consumers just saying, please don't, Black Friday was last week, Cyber Monday was this week. You see it all in the papers, you'll see on the news. The GDP spending are we going to have a good Christmas? Depends on the sales in the shops. We see all of that. And yes, we can tell people to consume less, but it's got to be driven by financial pressures to make them do it.
Yeah, so I was on Ian's point that I come across as a really positive sort of almost cheerleader of the circular economy in Australia, but actually I'm the biggest pessimist when it comes to human behaviour. I think we're really dumb and busy, actually, that we don't really need to be thinking so much about what we do and what we buy. I think most people just want the right thing offered to them. So as long as we're in this incredibly fast churning linear system and having to opt out of that to do the right thing, it's not going to happen. The system needs to change. And Ian talked about the sort of political drivers around that, but business needs to just step up and edit what they're offering to people and move to service models and things like that, that it just starts to make sense. And it's hard for consumers to do the wrong thing. And stop blaming it all on consumers. It's really hard to kind of do the right thing when we're just being told all the time to buy more and shop more and all that.
And just to add to that, yeah, I completely agree, right? So the generator role, we just, whilst we've got carbon targets, we haven't got material consumption targets, we haven't got design targets, we haven't got a Green Deal like Europe, we've got very little extended producer responsibility until we start actually talking to the generator about their obligations and stop treating it for like a negative externality that someone else stuck with. It's not going to change.
I'd like to go to you, Pat, for a moment. So all of the things you're talking about, when you add them all up and you look at the carbon budget every year, as you do you sometimes think I'm just an observer of the whole thing going wrong, or do you have other thoughts when you look at your numbers?
Yeah, no, I think that, I think we have created this situation. I think what people don't realize is that the climate problem is a cumulative problem. So it's nothing about what we do this year. It's what we've been doing for the last 200 years. And the truth of the matter is that, we're missing out on some of the lower targets. But again, we need to think about that climate change is kind of a slippery slope. We're just falling very quickly, and there are two critical things of this slippery slope. We want to smash the brakes as hard as we can so that we stop falling. There's no limit to how far we can stop, and therefore there's no limit to how far we can fall, and therefore how much we can actually do damage to the economy, to the environment, to our own health. But also it's very important to understand that every decimal point of a temperature that we can avoid, it is actually a big win for us, for the environment, for the economy. So yes, we're seeing some of these critical thresholds being almost missed already, but there's no end point to the damage. So we just want to stop and smash that brake as hard as we can, as soon as we can. I think your perception is correct, but also the perception is that there's no real thresholds or geophysical thresholds. It's a continuum, and we want to, stop as hard, as soon as we can.
Simon, I'd like to go to you again one more time. So taxing our externalities was mentioned by Ian. Are we anywhere close doing that, taxing externalities in Australia?
Yes. Well, I think Australia had a go at taxing externalities, and the political disruption as a result of that was deeply damaging to the body politic and to the capacity to achieve change. So we had obviously the carbon pricing framework established just over a decade ago now. We know it was effective in reducing Australia's emissions economy-wide, but it was also deeply damaging to our body politic and made it extremely difficult to achieve any action on climate change because of the reactionary forces at play, which saw ultimately the repeal of that framework. So moving forward, I think the new government has said very clearly that it wants to It wants to have mechanisms in place that require emissions-intensive industries to address their emissions, but without that taxation on the externality directly. But there will be a form of impost on extractive industries through regulation and through a requirement to abate and reduce the cost and incentivise industry to find a reduction in the costs of their extractive processes. So the development of the new safeguard mechanism and the requirement on emissions-intensive industries to reduce their emissions or abate their emissions and having an effective price around that abatement will be, I think, a very pragmatic way forward without an economy-wide carbon price. So, and I think we're going to continue to see the new government doing that in a range of sectors. So we won't have an overarching economy-wide carbon price, but we will have an effective carbon price in different sectors of the economy through regulation. Is as perfect or as elegant as an economy-wide carbon price? No, but it is, I think, a very pragmatic way forward in the history of the political environment that Australia has been through over the last decade, and it will, if designed well, impose the costs that we need imposed on emission-intensive industry. So we're yet to see the detail of that, but we know it's a very high priority for the government, new federal government, and we look forward to seeing that detail hopefully early in the new year.
Thank you, Simon. We're coming to the end of the hour. I'd really like to thank all our panelists today, Gail, Jordy, Simon, Pep, Ian. I was hoping in bringing you together, we can show a perspective from policy, from science, and from industry. I think we did that. You did that. I was also hoping that you will have some joy and entertainment by meeting each other, which I hope did also occur. We opened the Industrial Ecology Day, so mission achieved on that one. We're next going to Tokyo, so people who want to join the Tokyo event, please do that. And I thank you all, and I thank all the people who joined us today in the webcast, and I hope we meet again.